All right, let's talk about something we almost never question, our deepest values. The things we call good, evil, right, wrong. We tend to treat them like they're the laws of physics, just permanent, unchanging, universally true. But what if they're not? What if somebody, somewhere, invented them? Now, that is the explosive idea at the heart of Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. So let's dive into this masterpiece and watch as Nietzsche puts on his detective hat to investigate the history of our own conscience. I mean, think about it for a second. Where do our ideas of good and evil really come from? It sounds like such a simple question, right? But what Nietzsche shows us is that the moment you start to really push on that question, the whole foundation starts to feel a little shaky. The common sense answer, the one we all kind of grow up with, is that they're just there. That things like compassion and humility have always been good, and that pride and power have always been evil. It feels so innate, doesn't it? Like we all have this moral compass built right into our soul, always pointing toward a fixed, true north. But Nietzsche, well, he was a bit of a provocateur, and he just wasn't buying it. He looked at these values not as some divine truth, but as human inventions. Like a tool or a piece of pottery. And if they're invented, that means they have a creator, a time and place they were made, and a purpose. So he asks this question, a question he calls dangerous. Who actually benefits from us believing that weakness is good and strength is evil? What was the endgame here? And for him, this wasn't just some boring historical question. It was a deep psychological dive into the very soul of modern humanity. Okay, so before Nietzsche can lay out his own pretty radical theory, he's got to clear the deck first. And he starts by taking aim at the most popular explanation floating around at the time, a theory from a group he kind of lumps together as the English psychologists.
So these thinkers, a lot of them from the British utilitarian school, they were also trying to figure out morality without bringing religion into it. You could say they were setting the stage for him. But in Nietzsche's eyes, they got it completely, fundamentally wrong. Their theory was, well, it was neat, it was tidy, and, as we're about to see, it totally missed the epic drama of the real story.
So the English idea was pretty simple. They basically said that way back when, good wasn't really a moral word. An unselfish act was just called good by whoever got something out of it, because, hey, it was useful to them. And then over a long time, people just got into the habit of it. They forgot why they first called it good, and they mistakenly started thinking that being unselfish was just good, period. So you got this little formula. It starts with usefulness, then you forget, it becomes a habit, and boom, you have an error that we now call morality. Nietzsche thought this explanation was just awful, completely unsatisfying. He called it ahistorical because he felt like they were just taking their own 19th century English values and projecting them all the way back to the beginning of time. He argued that the word good absolutely did not come from the people who received kindness. For Nietzsche, that's getting the psychology completely backwards. The real origin of good, he says, had nothing to do with being useful, and it had nothing to do with the powerless. It actually came from the exact opposite place. And this, right here, brings us to the absolute core of Nietzsche's argument. He says the word good doesn't have one single history. It has two. And these two histories are locked in a life or death struggle. He uncovers these two completely opposed moral systems, which he famously calls master morality and slave morality. Okay, let's start with the original meaning of good. According to Nietzsche, the very first people who came up with this value weren't thinking at all about what was useful to other people. Nope, they were thinking about themselves. The judgment good was basically an act of self-praise by the powerful, the noble, the ruling class. So, master morality. This is the morality of the conqueror, the aristocrat. It just flows out of this feeling of overflowing strengths and life. To them, good is just another word for noble, powerful, high class. And bad? Well, bad isn't evil, not yet. Bad is just everything that isn't them. The common people, the weak, the lowborn. The whole system is built on what Nietzsche calls a pathos of distance, this deep, unshakable feeling that there's a huge gap between them, the top tier, and everyone else down below. It's a morality that screams a powerful yes to life, with all its struggles and triumphs. And for thousands of years, this was pretty much the only game in town. The values of the warrior, the nobleman, the hero, those were the values. But then, Nietzsche pinpoints this moment in history where something absolutely mind-blowing happens. A quiet, psychological revolution that would flip this entire system completely on its head. A total reversal of every value. So let's just lay these two opposing worlds side by side. With master morality, values come from the nobles. It's all about power, strength, pride. The big distinction is good versus bad, and bad just means common or pathetic. It's all driven by this powerful yes to life. Now flip that. Slave morality starts with the oppressed, the weak, the suffering. It doesn't really create values from scratch. It reacts against the masters. Its core values are the things that make life easier for the powerless: pity, humility, patience. And this is huge. The key distinction isn't good/bad anymore. Now it's good versus evil. And the driving force isn't self-love. It's a deep, simmering psychological poison that Nietzsche gives a special name: resentment. So the big question is, how on earth did this happen? How did the morality of the weak actually manage to defeat the morality of the strong? The answer, according to Nietzsche, lies in this very specific, very creative kind of hatred, a psychological weapon so powerful it would literally change the course of history. Nietzsche says this whole revolt didn't start with just any powerless group. It started with the priestly class. Think about ancient Judea under the Roman Empire. Unlike the warrior nobles, the priests are physically weak, but they are geniuses of the spirit. They're clever. And since they can't win on the battlefield, they start a totally different kind of war, a war of ideas. A war fought in what he calls the dark workshops of the soul. This whole thing kicks off, he says, when that resentment, that ressentiment, stops being passive and actually starts creating new values. So let's really nail down what this resentment thing is. It's not just being resentful. It's this deep, festering hatred, a toxic brew of envy, anger, and the feeling that you're totally powerless to do anything about it. It's the feeling you get when you can't fight back directly, so you're left to stew in your own imaginary revenge. But, and this is the genius move, that imaginary revenge becomes real. It doesn't just dream of the masters being punished, it rewrites the dictionary of morality to define the masters themselves as evil. Here's how this psychological jujitsu actually works. Step 1. The powerless feel this burning hatred for the strong, happy people ruling over them, but they can't do anything about it. So their minds pull off this incredible flip. They look at the nobles and say, you know what? You're not good. You are evil. All that strength, that pride, that happiness you feel, that's actually proof of your wickedness. And then comes step 2, the finishing move. They look at themselves and say, and we, the weak, the humble, the suffering, we are the good. Our weakness isn't a flaw, it's a sign of our moral greatness. It's a choice, something to be proud of. And just like that, bam, the entire moral universe gets turned on its head. And Nietzsche's own words here are just chillingly precise. He describes it like he's taking a tour of the workshop where ideals are manufactured, and he can hear them whispering. The inability to get revenge gets rebranded as forgiveness. Being too scared to fight back gets a new label: patience or humility. A person's simple weakness, their basic reality of being harmless, is spun into a voluntary achievement, something they chose to be. This, for Nietzsche, is the dark magic of slave morality. So, the victory of this new morality didn't just change the dictionary, it fundamentally rewired the human brain. And in the next part of his argument, Nietzsche dives into the murky origins of one of our most personal and painful feelings: guilt. Nietzsche's argument goes something like this. For most of our history, humans were basically wild animals. All our aggressive instincts, our drive for freedom, for cruelty, for destruction, were pointed outwards, at our enemies, at nature. But then, a huge thing happened. We built society. We basically put ourselves into what he calls a social straitjacket. The walls of the city, the laws, all the rules of living together, they slammed the door on our ability to just let those powerful primal urges run wild. So what happens to all that bottled up energy? It can't just vanish into thin air. And here's Nietzsche's brilliant and kind of terrifying insight. It gets turned inward. It gets aimed at the only target left: ourselves. All those wild, free-roaming instincts, he says, turn themselves backwards against man himself. We literally started to hunt ourselves. This turning inward of cruelty is the birth of what Nietzsche calls the bad conscience. It's the human soul literally at war with itself. And for him, this is the strangest and most profound sickness humanity has ever experienced. We became these animals that beat ourselves bloody against the bars of our own cage. This constant self-attack, this inner torture, that's what we call guilt. And it was the terrible price we had to pay for civilization. All right, so in his final act, Nietzsche pulls all these threads together to give us his diagnosis of the modern world. He focuses on what he sees as the ultimate triumph of slave morality, the complete victory of something he calls the ascetic ideal. This is the ideal of self-denial, and he's about to show us its really shocking and paradoxical legacy. So the ascetic ideal was the ultimate weapon of the priests. It finally gave an answer to the question of human suffering. Why do you suffer? It's not random, it's not unfair, it's because you're guilty. You actually deserve to suffer. Now, this was a life-denying idea, for sure, but it was also incredibly powerful. But here's the twist. It had a fatal flaw. The ascetic ideal valued one thing above all else: truth. And this relentless drive for truth, which was sharpened for centuries by the Christian conscience, eventually evolved into the scientific conscience. And this will to truth, when it finally becomes totally honest with itself, turns around and looks at its own origins. It looks at religion, it looks at morality, and it realizes they're built on a lie. As Nietzsche puts it, Christian morality is this awe-inspiring catastrophe that, at the very end, forbids itself the lie involved in belief in God. And that's where Nietzsche leaves us, standing right on the edge of a cliff. We are the end result of this 2,000-year-long slave revolt. We live and breathe its values. Our conscience was literally forged in those dark workshops he described. But we're also the result of the will to truth that the same morality gave us, a will to truth that has now kicked out the foundations from under its own feet. Nietzsche doesn't give us any easy answers here. He just digs up the messy, uncomfortable origins of our moral beliefs, forcing us to face a huge, unsettling question. If our ideas of good and evil aren't timeless truths, but are actually a cage we built for ourselves, can we ever step outside? Can we create new values, something beyond good and evil? That is the challenge he leaves for every one of us.